Welcome to the 23rd lecture in our series on prosody. We've talked a lot about the different forms and functions of prosody, and today we'll summarize those three realms into which they fall, talk about a possible evolutionary justification or explanation for some of those phenomena, and also talk a bit about how different social misinterpretations can arise. So if you take a look at this picture of all these dogs, which of them do you think would probably have the deepest bark or the lowest voice? Probably the largest dog. That's because there's a correlation between large body size and a larger larynx, which in turn is correlated with longer vocal folds, and thus correlated with slower vocal fold vibration, which gives rise to lower pitch. There are also some factors in terms of the length and shape of vocal tract that give rise to different resonances in larger or smaller vocal tracts. And you can imagine that a smaller dog might try to make itself sound bigger by lowering the pitch of its bark or its growl. And we could digress and talk a little bit about, or speculate about, the relative pitch differences between male and female speakers and their relative size, but that's another story. But this correlation between large body and lower pitch is often referred to as the frequency code. And that at its basis is paralinguistic. It has to do with the body shape. We have this bigger language, lower pitch, probably larger individual, and there is an association or linkage between low pitch and dominance. And so expressing that lower pitch associated with dominance might yield to an expression of lower pitch for certainty, things that are associated with dominant characteristics. Similarly, expressing finality or indicating that you're not asking a question but you're sure or declarative about what you're saying. Now, this use has now shifted from paralinguistic to entangle the pragmatic domain, and we see cross-linguistically that there are many phenomena that are marked out by low pitch, and the paralinguistic factors feed into the production and use of low pitch. Now, some of these associations might be a bit tenuous in this sort of chain of reasoning we've made, but this entanglement is real, and the entanglement among domains in terms of prosody form and function are a reality and lead to some challenging things in terms of understanding what's being said. So we can look at the entanglement of these realms through the lens of creaky voice. So if we think about what creaky voice is used to express, we see lots of uses of creaky voice. So one environment is when an airline pilot gets on at the beginning of their flight and starts explaining the plan for the flight, when you're going to take off, when you're going to arrive, and if their voice is creaking, is that a display of authority or knowledge, or is that a sign that they're tired and not really engaged? Well, both creaky voice can be used to express both of those, and the interpretation is how it's perceived by a listener. There's a lot of work on the use of vocal fry by young professional women in the popular press that can be kind of confused because different people may perceive the use of this one prosodic phenomenon in different ways and associate it with different meanings. And creaky voice is particularly challenging because, as you can see on the slide, there are many, many functions of creaky voice. And those sorts of misunderstandings or differences in perception can lead to significant challenges. And it's one of the things that makes working with prosody tricky. And this is in part because prosody carries across these three different realms and implies and utilizes the same sorts of forms to produce many, many different meanings across those realms. And this can be confusing. It can differ significantly when you're dealing with speakers of different dialects who come from different sociocultural backgrounds, or, for example, when you're dealing with a language learner who might have influence from their L1 in terms of their production of these sorts of prosodic phenomena. And we'll talk about that particular issue more in a later lecture. Now, generally, we do understand each other, even though these multifaceted phenomena are all being pushed through the same acoustic channel. But it's worth thinking about the fact that we have superimposed many of these different prosodic constructions and are therefore transmitting many potentially superimposed prosodic meanings simultaneously. And that's all going through this relatively narrow channel of speech, especially in contrast to something like vision, where you can see facial expressions and changes in eyebrow position or hand gestures or even finger positions and hand shapes. So that's a very wide channel. Speech is comparatively narrow, but still conveys a lot of information. And that makes prosody rather busy in terms of what it's conveying. Now, we've seen in these three different realms, the paralinguistic, phonological, and pragmatic, the different relations between form and meaning that are captured in this table. And we've seen, importantly, that these different realms require different types of modeling techniques. And in some problematic examples we saw in earlier lectures, using the wrong type of modeling technique from another realm to apply to the current realm of interpretation can cause a lot of confusion and all sorts of unpleasant problems. So it's important to pick the right model for the realm you're working in. Now, we'll delve into one of these particular factors and look at the independence of prosody and lexical content in various settings. So, is pragmatic prosody really independent of words? And the answer there is somewhat yes, sometimes no. So, if you do something and say an utterance like, "it was a big fish," where the prosody is specifically aligned with the word big, it can then modulate that word meaning specifically. So it's not fully independent, but it can be much more independent in many of the other settings in which we use pragmatic prosody, and we'll take a look at the last of these here. So generally, we have access to many sources of information to pull out the particular interpretation of an utterance in context. So we can use the context in which it's said, the specific words that are articulated, and the prosody with which it's said. And generally, those come together and sort of coordinatedly point to one particular meaning from the scope of possible interpretations. And in fact, this information can be somewhat redundant and reinforcing, so if you don't maybe hear a particular word clearly, the prosody might be able to disambiguate it for you and help you focus in on that particular meaning. But sometimes prosody goes off and does its own thing in terms of interpretation, as in this example. So we have a sentence like, "I love ethics," produced here.
I love ethics.
And here you see the prosody kind of conflicting with the surface level interpretation of those words, and it's that contradiction that gives rise to the interpretation of sarcasm, as the words in the prosody conflict in their meaning. So now we've seen a whole range of prosodic functions and talked about the three realms in which the form and meaning come together. And as we go into the next lecture, we'll be focusing on technology and applications and how prosody plays a role there, and we're going to start with a focus on speech synthesis.